All right, so here we are live. This is Miano Gone Wild, and we've decided to forego the intro song. Sorry to those of you that may have been looking forward to it. And I have Mr. Mike Bull joining me this evening. He is the author of Moses and the Revelation, Why the End of the World is Not in Your Future. And I know he has quite a few other books that we'll be blessed to hear about, and that if you purchase and you obtain, that you will find yourself edified by. So, Mike, thanks for taking some time out to join me on tonight's show.
Thanks. It's great to have the opportunity to rant.
All right, amen. Amen. Understood. Let's just go to the Lord in prayer, if you don't mind, and then I'm just going to open up and ask you to share a little bit, and we'll move into our discussion.
Cool.
Mighty God, we do thank you, Lord. We thank you for the privilege to have this opportunity to go on the airwaves, Lord, and to connect New York to Australia. Lord, I thank you for Mike Bull's resource. I thank you for this book. I thank you for the edification that I know I received in my reading of this book. And I do pray that you will be with us. I know that you will be with us as we enter into a bit of dialogue and discussion this evening, prayerfully edifying the saints, Lord, and glorifying you. So thank you for your presence in our lives. Thank you for your spirit that illuminates these truths and allows us to be blessed thereby. Thank you, Lord. We lift up all things for your glory and your praise alone. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
So I'm excited to kind of move right into things. I don't know too much about you. So I know you're from Australia. I know the time is quite a bit different from here. I believe you're into Wednesday already. And
oh, no, other way, so, Friday. It's Friday here.
Friday. Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, I know you're a day. Yes, I'm thinking as if we were doing the show on Tuesday. So into Friday. That's right.
Okay. Yeah. Yep.
All right. So thanks for taking some time out. Please share with us a little bit about yourself, maybe what you do for a living, some of your studies, and then we'll move forward in the conversation.
Yeah. Okay. I'm a graphic designer. I do a lot of work for industry and tourism in this area, so that keeps me pretty busy. I'd like to be writing theology full time, of course, but then I guess it would be a job and I'd hate it. So having it as a hobby kind of makes it a bit. It's like, I get to write now, so that's good. I've been blogging for a few years, and yeah, I got into James Jordan and Peter Lightheart probably about 10 years ago, and I thought, look, there's a lot more that could be said. I wanted to share their material in a more condensed form, so I wrote a book, but the book turned out to be about 700 pages, and it's a bit sloppy when I look at it now, so I want to rework it. But yeah, there's just a lot to share. So I blog a lot. Peter Lightheart asked me to write for the Theopolis Institute blog a few years ago, so I had to improve my writing. It was a good opportunity to do better work. So yeah, that's kind of where it's at the moment. Yeah, there's.
You had mentioned blogging a lot. Do you have a personal blog that you maintain?
Yeah, I've actually got a couple. One is just on the biblical structure, which is biblematrix.com.au.
Oh, okay.
And you can find a link to the other blog, which doesn't see, too much now. It's a little quiet, but it's still there, and there's a lot of material on there as well. So there's a link to the other one from that one.
Great.
But yeah, most of the work is on there, and I have articles on Theopolis Institute as well.
Wow. Okay, great. I know you mentioned the Bible Matrix, and of course, we're going to get back to that topic so we can learn a little bit more about what you mean by the Bible Matrix.
Yep.
Okay, so you mentioned James Jordan, and I remember in the book, Moses and the Revelation, I know you mentioned James Jordan and being influenced by his, maybe a lecture he had given on Revelation. And I'm curious, what were some of the things early on that influenced your interest in the book of Revelation?
Yeah, well, I got a copy just by chance of David Chilton's Days of Vengeance when it came out in the late 80s. Mm-hmm. And I just saw it in a local Christian bookstore, so I grabbed it. Most of my friends were dispensationalists. Some of them were sort of more reformed. But I read that, and it was the first time I'd heard of preterism. and it seemed to make a lot of sense. But then probably 20 years later, I was listening to Ken Gentry's lectures on Revelation, and that seemed to fill in a few more blanks. It was very good. But then I came across James Jordan's Revelation series, and he has 204 lectures in the series. Goes for 144 hours, which I guess is very kind of biblical number. But so I listened to those over a year. Some of them I listened to more than once. But the reason that they're so long is because Revelation refers to just about every book of the Bible, and so he used Revelation as a window on the rest of the Bible. So he'd say, okay, we're looking at this text in Revelation now. Let's go back to Ezekiel or Daniel or wherever, or the Torah, and see what the background is, why this is being referred to. An example would be the woman with the cup towards the end of Revelation. So he would take us back to Numbers 5, and we'd look at the jealous inspection. And I thought this is a unique way of interpreting it. So in contrast to Ken Gentry and David Chilton, Jordan uses the Old Testament to interpret rather than Josephus. So the book is not just about the Jewish war. It's actually about the process from the ascension of Christ leading up through the apostolic testimony to the destruction of Jerusalem. So it's quite a different approach. It's still preterist, but the interpretive method is quite different.
I definitely picked that up from reading your book, and I know we're gonna get into that. I appreciated that while I know the historical context, and I definitely see fulfillment in the first century, I appreciated that you kind of brought us back to the scriptures. And I imagine that has a lot to do with the Bible matrix and how instead of looking at only history, we're also taking a look at, the other portions. For example, you mentioned the book of Numbers, and we're seeing how the book of Numbers or the book of Exodus or the Torah as a whole is influencing the details that we're finding in the New Testament. And I love that. Again, I love the history, but I think bringing us back to the scriptures and allowing us to, I want to steal a phrase from you here I have written down, to maintain a consciousness of the rhythm of the scriptures, right? As you talked about maintaining that in the book of Revelation. I love that because it's bringing us back into gaining that understanding, that consciousness, as I believe you referred to it. So thank you. Again, I want to make sure I say thank you for such a great work.
Well, that's all right. Like I said, that was from an observation from James Jordan, which was based on their sort of studies of covenant structure, which is what it is. And so when you see that the Bible's written in cycles and that they align with each other, and that's part of the way the Bible refers to other texts, is the actual structure, not just images or words, but if a passage follows the order of the creation week, then we're supposed to be in on the joke. We're supposed to know the tune, and sometimes we don't get what's going on because we don't get the joke. So, it's not a joke, but it's I think it was one of Peter Lightheart's students and I mentioned that in the book. He says, reading the Bible is like watching Shrek. If you don't know your nursery rhymes and your fairy tales, when you see there's a wolf in the bed, you don't go off and write a 3,000-word dissertation on wolves in the ancient world. You get the joke. So Revelation is just all jokes, really. Like it's like meme war. It's you've got to know the Bible, and then you go, wow, this is really cutting and really funny. So And once it's opened up, once you get permission to read it in that way, and you understand what's going on, all of a sudden, it's so rich and so deep. And it's much less of a mystery. Yeah.
I appreciated the Shrek analogy because I have to admit something now. I had done a debate. I did a debate 2 years ago on the book of Revelation. And I hadn't watched Shrek. I have watched Shrek now, but I hadn't watched Shrek up until that point. However, I had read some of your thoughts about audience relevance. So I stole that thought there. And I mentioned that during my Revelation debate about Shrek. And it seemed as though the whole audience understood it. And in my head, I was like, man, I really have to go back and watch Shrek.
I don't know who came up with it, but it was one of Peter Lightheart's students at New St Andrews, I think. So he stole it as well. So maybe we should go back and find out who actually came up with that idea, because it's brilliant. Yeah.
It sure is. It sure is. Matter of fact, I was telling somebody earlier today, one of the ways that for me that I've grown a lot of my understanding is that audience relevance, and to see how it's missed. So many people, I forget who it was, J.I. Packer, I believe, said it best. He said that we do not know how far we've been influenced by our presuppositions and the things that we presuppose, and the cultural nuances that we miss because we're not in that set culture. Again, that's amazing. So I did want to go back to the Bible matrix. So I imagine when you began talking about cycles aligning with each other, that's bringing us into basically what the Bible matrix is, correct?
Yes, yeah, it is. And it basically is how can I put it? I mean, I remember after I wrote my first book, someone said, "Oh, you're saying the Bible is a fractal?" And I replied, "Well, I don't know what a fractal is really," so I had to look it up. But I pretended that I knew, But basically, it's like it's constructed like a tree or like broccoli. That if you break a bit of broccoli off the main piece, it looks like a miniature of the whole thing. And that's the way the Bible's constructed. It's made organically, but what it means is that every part of it follows the same structure, and that pattern is first found in Genesis 1. So in Genesis 1, it works through a sevenfold pattern, creating the physical world. Genesis 2 follows the same pattern exactly, but it's establishing a social order. And then Genesis 3 works through a similar pattern, establishing the ethical order. So straight away, you've got this architecture. And unless we have those patterns, which it's really this one single algorithm. You've only got to learn one pattern. It just gets expressed in different ways. And so I believe that is the key to a lot of not only understanding what the point of the Bible's authors is, but it helps you to get a lot of their jokes too. I'll give you an example. I'm just working through Matthew 24 and 25 and the structure, and the verse where Jesus says, where the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. And he's working through Israel's festal calendar, and the last feast, the Feast of Tabernacles or Booths, also known as Ingathering, was when Israel, now purified after the Day of Atonement, would have a big party for the Gentiles. So they've been working through their calendar all year, and now it's like, yep, big party, invite all the Gentile believers as well, picturing the new covenant, and kill an ox, have some strong drink, all of that sort of stuff. And they'd harvest the grapes and the olives. But what Jesus is saying is, the Gentiles are going to come, but as scavengers, not as guests, because you're not pure. You've rejected the atonement, or that he was about to die, and you're going to be the meat on the table. So, it's actually a pretty nasty sort of a joke, really. But you don't get the jokes unless you understand those patterns. So, the audience that he was speaking to obviously would possibly get the jokes. They had these things. They knew their calendar. They, like the church calendar that our culture has had. It would just become a subconscious thing. So once you see these patterns, it really unlocks a lot of scriptures that might seem a bit obscure, but especially Revelation. If you know these structures, you can see straight away that this is about it's I talk about bookends. Moses is one bookend, Revelation is the other one, and you can't understand Revelation without having Moses under your belt. So right. Does that make sense? Yeah.
It sure does. It sure does. I think you actually explained what I was going to ask you here on the notes that I had sent you. One of the things I was curious about was I always hear people talk about chiasms and these chiastic patterns. And I know you had mentioned that a bit in the book. And I know you explained a little bit before, so please pardon my belaboring the point. However, for me, honestly, when I hear about chiasms, maybe I'm not a pattern guy as much as I want to be. And it frustrates me and it confuses me. So I know you gave a lot of good diagrams. Like one of the things I loved in the book was a lot of the diagrams that helped me kind of get a picture of what was going on in these patterns that you were mapping out throughout the scriptures.
Yeah.
I guess can you back up and maybe explain to us what a chiasm or a chiastic pattern is and how we can best understand that when we read the Bible?
Yeah. I think the best way to understand it is I'm a visual thinker. That's why I'm a graphic designer. So for me, it was thinking of the way a flock of geese, or I'm not sure if ducks do it, but they fly in a V pattern. And so all the Bible texts are written in this symmetrical pattern. So they work from, A down to, well, depending on how many points they have, A, B, C, D, C, B, A. And the creation week does that. A lot of texts do that in, it works at multiple levels. So I saw someone worked out at the I say chiasm, but I could be wrong. Who knows? Anyway, chiasm might be actually right, because it sounds a bit more like maybe the Greek letter, because it's it's an X pronounced ch. And that's just because the shape of a chiasm is kind of an X shape. It works towards the middle and then comes out again. So it's basically symmetry. So for instance, Ezekiel works from the garden, in a sense, where he has a vision of the Lord, and then the judgment works out into the land, where he talks to the land of Israel. Then it works out to the world, the nations surrounding Israel, and judges them. Then he works back in again to the resurrection of the nation of Israel after the exile, and then back into a new temple. So it goes garden, land, world, land, garden. And the New Testament does something similar. It starts off with Christ. The testimony goes to the Jew first. Then we have the letters to the Gentiles. Then we have letters to the Jews just before the judgment of Jerusalem. And then finally we have Revelation, which finishes the process. And so we have, that's how God works. Judgment begins at the house of God, goes out, judges the world, and then comes back again. And I think all of that is based on the relationship between the Father and the Son, in the sense that it's a there and back again, to use a phrase from Lord of the Rings, where, you go on an adventure and you come home, you go to work and you come home again at the end of the day. Abraham's children went to Egypt, and then they all, the nation came back again. So it's a forming and a filling. It's like breathing out and breathing in or a heartbeat, forming and filling. At every level, that's how God works, and that's how his covenants are shaped. So there's this symmetry in creation and cycles. And but the good thing is that it seems to me that the biblical authors were aware of this process, because all their writings are governed by the same sort of pattern, and that helps us to understand where they're coming from. That the structure is actually part of the message, which it just goes over our heads. We just see this stream of data because that's how we are trained to read things, but we need to know the tune. And it's like, I think I mentioned it in one of my books, where you hear Darth Vader's theme, it's time for Darth Vader. That's just how it is. So when you hear the tune again, you go, aha. And what's really amazing is sometimes, and a few times in Revelation, they actually run the pattern backwards. So I don't know if you've seen Doctor Strange, which is a Marvel movie, but at the end when they're in Hong Kong or something, and it's all been destroyed, but they're sort of fixing it, and everything's going backwards and kind of putting itself back together. And I'm like, that's like what's happening here, where in Revelation there's one bit where he's running the pattern backwards, and it's like everything's going, and it's like, I'm decreating you. I know Revelation 11, the bit where it says the ark of the covenant was opened in heaven. That's actually the end of a pattern where it runs the tabernacle sequence backwards. And he's saying, I'm taking you out of the land and I'm taking you right back to Sinai. And that's why there's trumpets and thunder and the ark is seen open in heaven. It's like, I'm the repo man. I'm coming to take back everything that I gave you. Same as Moses took everything that Joseph had given Egypt and said, you've been unfaithful. I'm here to, take it all back. And he's decreating them. He runs the pattern backwards. And it's about a sequence of about 3 chapters. So once you see that, you get the joke and it makes sense. You're like, whoa, this is pretty cool. And that's where audience relevance comes in. You can say, look, they do this in the movies. It's exactly the same kind of means of communication. So there's a lot of people in academia who just, they're just, we need to watch the Bible like it's a movie, get the tune and get the sequences and whatever. And that's when I think we've lost the culture today, because we've kind of put the Bible in a glass case and it's not allowed to communicate the way it was designed to. So, and yet, movies and TV, the best of them, are doing the same thing. So it's a lot of fun. That's, yeah. Apologies if I sound too enthusiastic, but
no, please, that's good. That's good. You're right.
Yeah, it's great. But yeah, when you get the jokes, sometimes, especially when they're texts that are very familiar, and you think, oh, that's what's going on here. That is so cool, So anyway, yeah. That answers the question.
Rightly noted. Let me say this, rightly noted, that I think I'm just as excited with audience relevance, to see that picture there. And I love how you've explained it as picking up the tune, right?
Yeah.
We're picking up the tune. And I think that's a beautiful explanation, because a lot of times that's when I'm teaching somebody something, that's what I'm hoping they'll do. They'll pick up the tune of what it is we're teaching from Scripture. And as I'm sitting here listening to you, it's funny, I could listen to you all day, because as I read through the book, how many times I was writing amen. And as you notice, even from the outline I sent you, there were so many things you said that, tying everything together. Like, one of the things I had written down that I thought was very significant was, if we want to understand the book of Revelation, we must remember that it is at the end of the Bible, not the beginning.
Yeah.
You're talking to a young man that was led to Christianity through a very obscure, very strange perspective of the book of Revelation. A matter of fact, the United Nations being the leopard-spotted beast, if you will, and, just starting with Revelation as the beginning, rather than rightly understanding where it is.
Yeah.
So,
and the thing is too, even with say, those sorts of the prophecy experts, I mean, the good guys and the bad guys in general are still clear. We know that Jesus is the good guy, and those things are more application. Like the reformers thought that the Pope was the Antichrist, and I'd say, well, you thought that was the interpretation. That was an application, and they were killing believers the way that the first century Herods and the rulers were killing Christians. So I'd say, well, they did make a correct application, and that's not to be discounted. But if we interpret it correctly first, then it'll give us a lot more insights as to what the actual details mean. So but Revelation, it still gets the message across, even when we don't quite get what's going on. But I think one of the things that James Jordan said that just blew me away, he said, look, in Genesis we have Adam and we have Eve and we have the serpent, and they're individuals. And then in Revelation we have the false prophet, we have the harlot, and we have the beast, and they're sort of the corporate versions of that rebellion in Genesis. And straight away you go, oh, that's what's happening here. Now I understand the relationship between these three, and that this is kind of like the mature, full-grown version of the sin. And James says, when sin is full-grown, then it brings forth death. And so that's why at the beginning of Revelation, Jesus is kind of nipping the same sins in the bud in the churches. And then he shows them the great city and says, this is what happens if you don't kill the weeds when they're small. Here's this great city where all those things are now so entrenched that there's no other recourse but destruction. So, but this one of these throwaway comments from James Jordan, and it's just like, whoa, hang on. So he's 144 hours is a big commitment. But what I wanted to do with this book is to sort of give you a bird's eye view and apply this particular structure in a way that helps you to see. You've kind of got to approach it from the distance, and then you can zoom in on the details. Once the context of each structure is given, then you can say, oh, okay, that's what that particular detail means in this context. So,
right.
Yeah. Anyway, sorry, these answers are a bit too long, but
No, that's great.
I used to teach the Bible at the local high school, and it's great to have a captive audience.
Yeah, sure. I believe it. Another question I wanted to ask you about is something you had said in the book that intrigued me. Here at our church, we do something with our responsive readings every Sunday. And what we have is somebody go up and they obviously recite a part of the passage, and then the congregation recites the following verses. And I found this to be very edifying. And I believe, unfortunately, when I go to other churches, a lot of times it's just a forward focus rather than a involved focus. And you had said this. You said part of the reason that we moderns fail to understand the Bible is that we rarely hear it read aloud. And see, I began to think, wow, I agree with that in two ways. Not only do people need to hear the scriptures aloud, which I will tell you, and this is an honest, admitting thing here, that in my sermons, what I began to do after reading that remark in your book was I made sure I went through the bigger portions in the scriptures during my sermon. It challenged me, because a lot of us preachers, we spend a lot more time talking about our things, than we do the scriptures sometimes. I would like to say I don't. However, I'm going to put myself in that box. So I felt that it was a good challenge in that regard, that we read more scripture out loud. But then it also reminded me of the value that I see in that responsive reading. And I wanted to kind of get your thoughts. What came to mind when you said that? And what are some of the areas that you've seen the failure to understand the Bible because of a lack of reading it out loud? And then what are some of the gains that you've seen?
Well, first of all, that was an observation again from James Jordan, because he would actually, in a lot of these lectures, read the passage first. And he said, let the structure sink in. Let these passages, the Jews were not an oral culture in the way that people say, because they had scribes and the texts were written down, which is another argument for early dating of the New Testament documents. The Jews were people who were people of the book, and so even though not all of them could read and write, it was an integral part of their culture. But because even within this kind of literary heart of the culture, the texts were designed to be heard. So they were written as speeches. So, the Sermon on the Mount was designed, to be heard. And when you are writing something to be read publicly or recited publicly, you use different sorts of devices. And so I think there's things that you get with the rhythm of speech when you hear it that you don't get when you read silently. And so I think, the church that I attend, they have the traditional liturgical sequence. It's an Anglican church, and it's funny that pattern follows the Bible matrix. There it is again. It works through the sevenfold pattern, which is kind of good because I'm a bit autistic. It's like, pattern, great, this is good. Yeah. But it's the pattern of creation. It's day 7, and here we are. We're working through the 7-day pattern on the first day of the week, and that is then the pattern for our life. So that's another thing that Jordan and Lightheart are good at. They say that the purpose of liturgy is to train us in the ways of God, so that then in the garden, in a sense, and then we go out and we replicate that in the land and in the world. So we have 3 readings, which is I think the traditional Anglican way of doing things, and the psalm reading is usually responsive. I don't think they don't do it with other texts, but I think it's good because it includes the congregation in not only hearing the text but also reciting it. And once again, it's a conversation like that between the Father and the Son by the Spirit, where you have that there and back again pattern as a word and a response, a word and a response. In a sense, heaven and earth, bridegroom, bride. It's just how creation is built. So there's this to and fro in everything, this kind of cyclical pattern. So I think there should be more of that. I'm not sure about in the sermon. I think sometimes we just get like a single verse, and a friend of mine said that's like a fortune cookie Bible verse where it's just one little line, and you just it becomes sort of a mantra, and it's like, well, what's the context here? And I think people need the context, but also I think that people tend to, when they hear, he's quoting a long passage from the Bible now, they tend to switch off. If it's in a sermon, it's like, I'll just blank out now until he's finished. So I think we possibly need to read the scriptures in a more not race through them, just to say, okay, we've read the Bible bit now, let's get back into what I'm saying. But if we read them with a bit more rhetorical skill, I guess, and it's not always easy, but I think once people are shown that there's a logic to this pattern, it's not just a bunch of isolated truths, that there is a sequence here. So I think that's good. But it's great that you're doing that in the church, and that people get it's used to it, but also too that their voices matter. You know, you're speaking the words of God aloud as well, which is fantastic. There should be more of that.
Amen. You know, I think one thing that we definitely value at our church is narrative theology, putting that picture together. And also, you know, I'm going to use a phrase that you've said a couple times, is I believe a preacher's goal is to help the audience, or, you know, I don't like the audience. I don't really like to use that phrase. The congregation, to help those congregating with us to get the joke, as you put it before. You know, that's the whole thing, that we're all in. You know, I know for some it may sound funny. Maybe we'll say pick up the tune, to call the gospel a joke or a tune. However, that is the goal, right? To when we're there to help everybody get the tune, to get the joke, and to be a part of this great thing God is doing, right? That should be the goal.
Yeah. So I mean, I have another book called Reading the Bible in 3D, which works through. It's a very simple book. It's like a primer, and it works through things like the Bible is a tune, the Bible is a story. But yeah, one of my favorite things is about the jokes, and the jokes in the book of Esther just blow me away. I mean, just very briefly, you know, you've got Joseph, who is treated pretty badly, and then he ascends to the right hand of the power, and he interprets Pharaoh's dreams and opens the mystery. And then you have Daniel, who does exactly the same thing, you know, ascends to the right hand of the power. He's vindicated as the wise man, and then he interprets Nebuchadnezzar's dreams. But in Esther, you've got this bad guy, Haman, who's an Agagite. So, and Mordecai is the son of Kish. So remember Saul, who's the son of Kish, and Agag, the king that he was supposed to kill, and he didn't. So this is a rematch. So as soon as those names are mentioned, you're supposed to go, aha, here we are again, you know, and they're kind of circling each other, you know. It's just this battle, and it's the Amalekites versus Saul. Right. Yeah, and but the funniest thing is instead of the king having dreams, he can't sleep. Okay. And that's when he says, bring in the historical records and read them to me. That's when he says, oh, Mordecai saved you from an assassination attempt. And then he calls in Haman, who is his wise man, and he says, what should the king do? And of course, Haman totally misinterprets the king, thinking that he's going to honor Haman. And so the joke is that he's not like Joseph and Daniel, who interprets the king's dreams. The king can't sleep, and he totally misinterprets what's going on. So, you know, if you know the pattern of the story, it's like the best sitcom, you know, where they're messing with it and turning everything upside down. That the Jew, it's now a girl instead of a guy, you know, but it's working through the same patterns and has the same message. And so that's when it's hysterical. Like it's just, you know, like it's really full on. And of course, Haman, who wants to be lifted up to the right hand of the power, is lifted up on his own gallows. So, you know, I think it was a comment a while ago. The only thing wicked about God is his sense of humor. You know, Amen. It's just he's crafty to the crafty. So I think, yeah, once you have permission to read the Bible like that and to see these sequences, you can be in on the joke. And when you share them with your people, they're like, oh, this is great. I want to read more of this. It's not a chore.
Amen. Yeah, sure. I think that's a part of it, getting the interest of people and helping them better understand the full story, right? That we like stories. So as a society, I don't know, you know, the church really needs to come together and realize that if our society likes stories, how do we help people best understand the best story, right? That's pretty much what we're doing. You know?
I'd make that's a really good point. And I think there's been a lot of attempts to do that, where people will take a Bible story and try to make it more relevant. But because they're not dealing in typology, they're making it relevant in ways that actually kind of violate the story. Like they're getting the wrong message from it. So with David and Goliath, for instance, it says Goliath had chainmail like scales. So straight away you're supposed to think, this guy's a snake. He's a beast. You know, that's what's going on here. And it says David was red-faced, and so he's like the face bread in the tabernacle, and Goliath falls on his face. You know, he can't face God. So if you've got to sort of you make the Bible relevant to people by making it relevant within itself, using its own images and types, rather than saying, okay, we've got this Bible story. We don't really, what's the point here? A lot of the details are irrelevant, but we're just going to sort of turn it into something that it's not really designed for. So they have to get the right jokes. Yeah.
Right. Yes. Fair enough. That's a good point, because again, we at our church will always say that. You'll hear us say something like, "That's a stretch," like we're obviously you're stretching that out a bit.
Yeah. I get that sometimes, but what I tend to do is say, okay, let's put that sequence next to this sequence, and they match. And you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, whatever. It's like A, B, B, C, C, D, D, E, E, F, F, G, G, whatever. And because they match like that, you can say, this is the same tune. That's what verifies the stretch, in a sense. It's the same tune. Therefore, we can make this comparison. So, it looks like a stretch sometimes.
I'm sorry?
Sorry? No,
I was asking you, sorry. I was talking while you were talking.
No, that's okay. Yeah, you didn't miss anything. That's okay.
Oh, I was just, again, I agree with you. I think it's necessary to understand the patterns. And, a lot of times in talking about correlating passages in the Bible, that becomes very necessary to kind of examine and to see the similar patterns that are found throughout different portions of the scriptures. And, and I believe what you're talking about with the Bible matrix, I've just read this one book by you, Moses and the Revelation. I know I look forward to getting my hands on some of the other works that you've put together. I know you mentioned the Bible in 3D. What I'm going to actually ask you to do before I go a bit further, I wanted to bring us, now that we were talking about stretching, I did want to bring us a little bit into the book of Revelation, one of the books that most people do the most stretching with. And,
Yep.
So I wanted to kind of bring us into a little bit of talk about that. However, I did want to ask, if you don't mind, can you tell us maybe not all of the books? I know you had said you have 13 books. If you know all of them, please tell us all of them. But if you don't mind, maybe pick out a few and share with us some of the names and what we can learn from them.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mentioned reading the Bible in 3D, which is you can get it on Amazon printed, but it's also online for free. And that's a basic introduction to this particular pattern that governs the scriptures. And it's a really good starting point, because it shows you that you can use the same sorts of skills that you get from watching good movies and reading good novels and listening to music when you read the Bible. And so that's a very good introduction. The next one is Bible Matrix. And there's Bible Matrix 2, which is more on the covenant structure, which relates to the creation structure. I think because Moses and the Revelation was written later, the rundown that you have at the beginning of that book kind of summarizes all of those things. It might be a bit brief, but it does run through all the basic patterns. And that's, for you to start with that book wasn't a bad thing, because you're getting all of that sort of, and probably a little more polished than those earlier books as well, because I'm getting better at this as I go along. And the first part of Moses and the Revelation is online as well. You can read that at biblematrix.com.au. I'm just trying to think what some of the other ones were. There's a few books of essays as well, which use this structure, but also make a lot of applications for instance, the tabernacle structure, which follows the pattern, helps us understand what happened in first century history. But then you can apply that to what's going on today with Islam and secularism, and the church kind of trapped in the middle, with these two enemies, which is exactly the same pattern as the church in the first century, with the Jews on one side and the Gentile Roman Empire on the other side, false priesthood, false kingdom, and the church in the middle with this united enemy, because they had a common enemy in the church. And so, you apply that today and you say, well, this is exactly the same pattern, just on a global stage now. So, we have a fair inkling how this is going to turn out, So it's just God works in layers, and it's always the same kind of structure. So we have Islam, which is sort of a, parody of priesthood in a sense. Don't question anything, circumcision for everybody, like it's just nuts. And then you have the West, which is kingdom, which is like Rome. It's like, yeah, do whatever you want. Like, yeah, and you know, gold, guns, and girls. You know, the three things that Moses said that the kings weren't to to abuse, to get into, and that's America. You know.
Sure is.
So,
Yeah, sure is.
Yeah, and then we have the church in the middle, and now we have secularism, which is kind of aligning itself with Islam against the church. I mean, they're so they hate each other in a sense, but then they have a common enemy in the church, and so it's the same pattern. So this Bible matrix structure actually is really practical. So I've got a few other books of essays which cover those sorts of things as well. So yeah, but look, they're all listed on Amazon. So yeah, you can find them there.
All right, I appreciate that. All right, so bringing us into Revelation a bit. One of the things that you had said that I wanted to bring us into is Revelation 1:1 is actually the entire book of Revelation in a microcosm. So I was going to ask if you can break that down, maybe explain to us what a microcosm might be for those that may not know. And then what do you mean by that statement that Revelation 1:1 is a microcosm of the entire book?
Yeah, well, as I said, God works in layers. And because the Bible is structured, I guess, like broccoli, I'd like to think of a better vegetable. But you know, every part of it, each like the whole stalk of broccoli is made of smaller versions of itself, and then each of those is made of smaller versions again. And so Revelation 1:1 follows that sevenfold structure, and then the entire book of Revelation follows the same structure. So as it works through this sequence, which I should probably just briefly mention what the sequence is. I've given the steps some names, and that's creation, division, ascension, testing, maturity, conquest, and glorification. And you can see that pattern in God bringing Israel from Egypt to Canaan. He calls them out, so that's the creation or initiation step. Calls Moses. Division is Passover and bringing Israel out of Egypt. Ascension is Moses on the mountain receiving the law, and then testing is obviously in the wilderness where the old Israel with their Egyptian hearts is not faithful, and then maturity is the new generation and giving the law again, and they believe. Conquest is obviously coming into Canaan and destroying Jericho and dividing up the land, and then glorification is the last one, and that's the book of Judges. And like Adam, Israel blows it. So they fail to maintain a priestly attitude towards God, so their kingly dominion of the land is limited. And that's exactly what happened with Adam. God created him, set him apart, gave him instructions and a bride, and then he's tested by Satan, the serpent. The maturity is when their eyes are opened, and then conquest is when God comes to judge them and clothes them. And then obviously step 7 is limiting the promises concerning the fruit of the land and the womb for Adam. So his dominion of the earth was given by atonement, but limited by curses. So the same pattern is everywhere, and that's how we are to understand these things. And when you get to Revelation, the book follows exactly the same pattern. So with Revelation 1 verse 1, let me just grab some water. Sorry.
Oh, go for it. While you're going ahead and drinking, I'm just going to read the verse for us.
Yeah, good idea. I'll try and find it in here too.
The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave to him to show to his servants things which must shortly come to pass, and he sent and signified it by his angel to his servant John. And again, that is reading out of the New King James Version of Revelation 1:1.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, the revelation is obviously step 1, initiation, light, God starting things off. And that's one thing, is the Bible's never a response to historical circumstances. It always comes in to change them. So that's the first step. The second step is Jesus Christ, who is the the mediator and the messenger. So and Passover, that's the second step. And then which God gave him. So Jesus ascends and receives the scroll just as Moses received the tablets. So that's step 3, which is ascension. Step 4 is to show, which has to do with testing and open eyes, and that corresponds to the lampstand and the day of Pentecost. Step 5 has to do with hosts and armies, and that's to his servants. What must take place is the conquest step, and that's the atonement, which is not just the tearing of the veil, but the destruction of the temple, which is the 6th part of the book. And then without delay is always to do with the future. So that's a time reference. So yeah, it actually works through the sevenfold pattern just in this one verse. But that also helps us to understand that this was a judgment that was going to occur in the 1st century. It gives us the context as well, and it's a covenantal judgment, that this is all of the curses of the law coming down upon those who had broken the covenant. But that last bit there, without delay, I mean, it's a bit of a joke, because the last step is about the succession of the faithful, and this is saying that these guys are going to be cut off from history. They're on the wrong side of history. They think that the temple is going to last forever, and that, as they did before, that with Jeremiah, they thought the temple would be there forever, but they ended up being on the wrong side of history. So even that last little bit there is a bit of a joke.
Yeah,
based on the sequence. Yeah,
sure is. Yeah, sure is. I know you said in the book, you said when Revelation appears to speak of judgment of the earth and the world, it is really speaking of judgment upon Israel and Rome, who had rejected the gospel of Christ, which again reminds us of the context of the joke, right? When we read the book of Revelation.
Yeah.
Go ahead, please.
No, that's right. It actually it ties in. It's not separate to the rest of the New Testament. The New Testament is in one part a lawsuit against the rulers of Israel. If you remember the last verses of Malachi, where he says, I'm going to come and smite the land with a curse. And so in Revelation, when you read the word earth, it should be the word land, translated land. It's the tribes of the land. And the world is, sometimes it refers to the cosmos, but there's a couple of different Greek words that are used for world, and one of them refers to the empire. And so that's the context. But Revelation does use the words land and sea. And so when you have the angel that gives the book to John, and he's got 1 foot on the sea and 1 foot on the land, that speaks of dominion over the Jews and the Gentiles in the new covenant. And that angel has this scroll, and both of them are going to be judged, just as the Jews and the Gentiles were judged in Ezekiel. And as I mentioned, that Revelation uses a lot of the imagery from Ezekiel, because it's a similar kind of judgment. So, but yeah, so the imagery is there, but also the idea that because Israel, the land of Canaan, was a microcosm of the dry land. This probably jumps ahead to what we're going to talk about, preterism down the track. So maybe I'll leave that to the end. The cosmic language. Yeah. So
actually, that's actually where I was looking to bring us. So that might actually work out right away. I do want to. There was a couple of things you had said. Let me see here. I just want to make some remarks that you had said from the book. So if you don't mind, I'll bring us right into talking a little bit about preterism. For those that may not be familiar, I imagine most people that are watching this are, probably familiar with the fact that I'm a full preterist and are waiting for me to figure out where you stand with full preterism. That's most likely most of the audience. However, for those of you that are not familiar with preterism is that view of past fulfillment. Now, there is that division there where some would say they are partial preterist, and then, of course, I would fall in that camp that is a full preterist. What I did appreciate about your book, Mike, was you said, and quote, "If you find the following thesis convincing, you may be ridiculed, ostracized, and even condemned as a heretic. Are you willing to join that number? True reform is glorious, but it is never achieved without risk." And, in my more recent years in understanding preterism, and coming to understand the preterist view in opposition to the dispensationalist view, which is the most popular. Even myself using the Dake's Annotated Reference Bible as my study Bible here. I've understood that ridicule. I've understood that ostracizing. And I appreciated you speaking to that. And I'm excited that you were willing to even get into these topics, talking about preterism. And I see so much beauty. And I believe even right now in our podcast, we've been talking a lot about historical things. And even from what we've brought forth, you drew out quite a few areas of application that, despite the fact that we look back to a past judgment, we can find plenty of application. And that's been something that has been, and I'll just say this last quote you had shared: we worship a God for whom even the pronouncements of judgment is a rousing song. And I believe that as a preterist, I believe that. So I guess I'm going to bring us into the discussion, because you did say this in the book, however, but some take this too far. And obviously that's where I wanted to kind of push us into conversation. Talking about fulfillment, you said, but some take this too far and claim that the entire Bible is fulfilled, no future judgment, no future coming of Christ. So where do you stand with preterism, and what are you speaking about in that passage there?
Yeah, one of the things that frustrates me with debates like this is that both sides use proof texts, and they just throw proof texts backwards and forwards at each other. And if the Bible is written as a repeated tune, that's like throwing notes back at each other. It's like, oh, well, I'm going to throw this B flat at you, and you throw back that F sharp. And it's like, yeah, but what's the tune? This isn't making sense. How do you interpret an F sharp if you don't have it in context in the tune, especially when it's a repeated tune? And so I thought, I really appreciate a lot of full preterists. James Jordan, to mention him once again, back in the early 90s, wrote a series of articles called The Future of Israel Re-Examined. And he was looking at the work of, is it Max King? Is that the guy's name? He's a full preterist. And he interpreted, because he's a full preterist, he had to interpret Romans 9 to 11 within that framework as occurring before AD 70 or leading up to AD 70. And Jordan he said, well, even though I'm not a full preterist, that actually makes sense. Like this guy has actually, he said, these things were future to Paul, but they're not future to us. So if AD 70 ended the Jew-Gentile divide, there are no longer any Jews in God's economy, because you can't relate to God in that way. If you've rejected Christ, then you can't relate to God. Like, that's just how it is, that all the other means are now obsolete. And that also means that there's no Gentiles, because if there's no Jews, there's no non-Jews, So,
right.
And so I really appreciate a lot of full preterist takes on things. And I actually tend to agree with a lot more of them than I guess the average partial preterist would, because if you read the context of the book, of the text, then that is what is being talked about at the time. And so to say, well, this one is full preterist and that text is, this one's referring to AD 70, that one's referring to the end of the world. Well, okay, a lot of the other things in those passages are actually very similar. How do you decide that without a presupposition? Like, you can't really prove that. And so I really appreciate the consistency of full preterists. However, because I'm dealing with biblical structure and biblical architecture, and the fact that God always does things in the same way at different levels and in different layers, we are able to extrapolate things. And I think that's where, you can say, well, the rest of the story here, you know how this goes. We don't need to fill it all in again. We don't need all of the Old Testament prophets talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, because we've already got that in the Old Testament. The same things apply now. The apostles are like, if you want to know what's going on, go back and read these guys, because it's the same kinds of sins in some way. It wasn't idolatry, but it was more subtle. The sin was more subtle now, because evil learns, like the devil doesn't always do the same thing. Before the flood, the devil tried to wipe worship out totally. You don't need worship at all. And then after the flood, what does he do? He establishes false worship at Babel. It's the next level. It's more subtle.
Wow.
And so in the New Testament, for Jerusalem to be spiritual Babylon is really sneaky. You know, it's just like, well, okay, I'm going to corrupt the actual center of worship now and turn it into Babel, even though it looks like Solomon's temple. It's just, you know, he's tricky. And that's why God always allows these curved balls to come at us. It's always some new kind of inversion. Like today, it's like, oh, well, socialism is Christian generosity. And we're like, hang on a minute. You know, like that's really sneaky. You know, he's really tricky. And that's where you need discernment. But now I'm off the track. What I was going to say was that the structures in Genesis, where you have Adam sinning in the garden, Cain murdering his brother in the land, and then you have the intermarriage between hang on, I will just ignore that, in the world. So there's this garden, land, world pattern, and I think that's the key. So you have that pattern all the way through the scriptures. The first section of the Bible is about worship centered in the Garden of, or outside the Garden of Eden. That's destroyed in the flood. Then God calls Abraham and sets up this miniature version of the world in the land of Canaan. So instead of the land being divided in the days of Peleg amongst all the people, it's now divided under Joshua, but it's a miniature land. I mean, I grew up in the 70s, and in those days, they didn't have CGI. So if you wanted to blow something up, you built a model, you know, like it was cheaper. You know, if you want to, in James Bond, if you want to blow up the guy's island where his base is, you build a model. Like, or watching the Thunder, I don't know if you ever saw the Thunderbirds, you know, it was all models. It's just how it is. Funny thing is, they're moving back to using models now because they look a bit more real in some cases. So Israel was a model of the world. And instead of having a physical flood, like in Daniel where it says the end will be with a flood, the Gentiles were the sea and Israel was the land, and the sea of Gentile troops would flood in. And in Hezekiah's day, the troops, God says, it's going to come up to the neck, like the walls of the city, and you're just going to be able to breathe just a little bit so you won't die. But this is, you know, you'll be submerged up to the neck in this flood. And then, of course, Babylon flooded the world in a sense. So it was a social flood. If you remember at the beginning, there's a physical creation in Genesis 1, then a social creation in Genesis 2, then the ethical, you know, call of Adam in Genesis 3. So history then is the physical world. Adam represented the physical world. And because he sinned, when that sin was full grown, the physical world was destroyed. And that's why there was a physical flood. And I believe because of that, it was global. Then to avoid another flood, because things were going downhill again after Noah, God called Abraham and divided the world in two and made Israel a sacrificial substitute world. And so instead of the entire world being flooded and destroyed, Israel would be flooded and destroyed. But this, of course, you know, the Jews came in, so Israelites came in and wiped out the Canaanites. And then when the Israel committed the same sins, God brought other nations to wipe them out. So, and then when you get to Genesis 3, the ethical, that's when you get to history, that's Christ. And he is the Adam who defeats the serpent. So physical as the outer layer, and then social, and then ethical as the central layer. And that's the pattern of the tabernacle, where you have the outer courts, and then you have the holy place where the priests would work, and then you have the Holy of Holies where God is. So there's this constant triune structure which has layers. So my argument with full preterism is that the prophets use cosmic language because Israel represented the world. So they would say, you know, the birds and the fish, and they'd refer to all this creational things, the stars falling from heaven. But those stars were kings, and the birds and the fish represent, you know, Jews and Gentile hosts. There's this land idea, and then you have the ethical one, which is Christ. So now that the land was judged, so we had Jesus' resurrection in the garden. Then I believe we had the resurrection of all the Old Testament saints and the New Testament martyrs who were taken to heaven and received their heavenly country. And then the gospel went out into the world. And that brings us to Revelation as well, where we have Jesus in the garden at the beginning. The lampstands were made to look like almond trees. In Hebrew, almond trees, the word is a watcher tree, I guess, because almonds look like eyes, you know. So there's these watcher trees, you know, but then now they're not. It's not a single menorah. They're actually split up into 7, so they're decentralized. And then he sends out the 4 horsemen, who are the testimony of Christ, the Gospels in a sense. So these 4 horsemen go out. One to bring the message, the second one to divide the people. It's a spiritual battle. The third one starves the unbelievers, and the believers persevere. And the fourth one then cuts off the unbelievers. And then they have this spiritual battle between the true and false Jews in the land. And then you get to chapter 19, where you see Jesus now with all the saints on white horses, and they ride, in a sense, through the divided corpse, like the Abrahamic animals, through the corpse of the land into the world. So even Revelation has this garden, land, world pattern. So my point is that even though preterism says this is the judgment of the land, you can then apply it. Now the gospel's gone into the world. But the covenant structure of Revelation says that there's the first step, which is Jesus. He's the one in charge. Then he speaks to the churches, which is delegation. Then we have the spiritual warfare. Then we have the atonement, which is the destruction of the temple. And then we have the last section, which is succession. And that's where the bad guys have been judged and the good guys have won. I don't know if you've seen, this is basically the structure of every Marvel movie. You know, there's always the big fight at the end, you know, between the good guy and the bad guy. Things come to a head. I mean, it's the first Star Wars movie, you know, there's the big battle. And then at the end of Star Wars, what happens? The bad guys are, you know, expelled or killed. And the good guys have a big ceremony and they get some medals and they're given the future. And that's why there is a future bit in Revelation, and that's the succession at the end where, okay, all of the Judaizers and the Herods and all these bad guys have been judged, and now we're looking to the future. And that's why I believe that there is this future judgment. Every covenant has a reckoning, because every covenant is a tour of duty. God is always going to come and inspect the fruit. And so that's why we have this period of 1,000 years, which is a symbolic number. So there's a resurrection in the garden, there's a resurrection in the land, and then finally, what's called the second resurrection in Revelation, we have the final resurrection of all the saints from this era as the resurrection of the world. So it's about architecture. Does that explain where I'm coming from? So I'm saying full preterism's right as far as it goes, but history is social, ethical with Christ. Then the social bit is the church now, and then it'll go back to the physical and the destruction of death at the end of history. So all those 3 domains relate to each other, but history is a chiasm with Jesus in the middle. And so it's working out now through the social testimony to the nations, and then finally at the end, the physical order will be restored and the final judgment. So, and just one quick other observation as well. That 7-fold pattern I mentioned, where step 3 is Moses on the mountain receiving the tablets. In Revelation, it's Jesus ascending and opening the scroll. In the final section of Revelation, Jesus opens the books at the last judgment. And so once again, he's there, and it's like, okay, that's like the bookend. He opened the scroll at the beginning of the new covenant. Now he's opening the books of judgment at the end, and he's going to say, okay, like God coming to Adam, where's my fruit? You know, I'm here to collect, you know? I think once we get the structures under our belt, I think, that's it. And it's not a big jump from full preterism just to say, well, okay, most of these texts still apply to the first century, but that's the land. And now we can apply that to the world, you know, that there will be a final reckoning. I think that's my main point. Yep.
I appreciate that. So what you did was, I was familiar with James Jordan, and I'm sure you're also familiar with, what's his name? Gary DeMar.
Yep.
And I actually say that Gary DeMar is the most full partial preterist that I have ever studied. You know, he tends to be the one that seems the most consistent in the full preterist perspective. So, with that being noted, I always knew James Jordan and Gary DeMar believed in what I would say is maybe a detached eschatology. That might have been the more derogatory view for it. However, what I believe you did was you helped fill in the blanks there for me a little bit to understand the perspective. Because what you're saying is that, yes, we can look back to, as you even said in the book, since Jesus's words were fulfilled, just as he said, the historical events of AD 66 to AD 70,
Yep.
you then turned that and you said that the modern church has unfortunately entirely missed that. However, that points to the future judgment that you're bringing up, that points to the reliability, the faithfulness of Christ and the judgment that, that he will bring about on the world if we follow that pattern that you're bringing about. Correct?
Yeah, and just to simplify that too, I mean, Jesus was vindicated in his resurrection. He said he would rise from the dead. And when he ascended, the two men at the ascension, who were probably Moses and Elijah, the two witnesses, there they are again. They said he'll return in like manner. And I believe that that's referring to AD 70 because, the high priest would make two approaches on the Day of Atonement, one for the leaders, one for the priesthood, etc., and one for the people, the head and the body. When they offered the ascension offering, they would offer their clean head. Then they would wash the body and they would offer the body. Both would ascend in a pillar of fire and smoke. So that's what you have. You have Christ ascending as the head, and then Revelation is about the spiritual warfare and the offering of the body, which is the first fruits of the saints to God and the Lamb. And so that's what they are referring to then. But AD 70 then is the vindication of Jesus' words in the land, just as he's vindicated in the garden in his words concerning his resurrection. So even that, the land judgment looked back to Jesus' faithfulness in his resurrection, that he was vindicated. And so what I'm saying is that, the final judgment, now we know that Jesus' words will be fulfilled because we can look back at the land and the garden. And so that's the same structure. So I think getting a handle on the tabernacle with the most holy as the garden, the two angels at either side of the ark are the two angels flanking where Jesus' body was laid. And then we have the holy place, which is where the three pieces of furniture represented priest, king, and prophet. And that's those who have office on God's behalf. And then we have the outer courts, which is kind of like the world where worshippers would come and make their offerings. So once you see that pattern in Revelation, it's like I don't know if you're familiar with Shakespeare's plays were always performed in a specially designed theatre called the Globe Theatre, and it was kind of circular, and it had places to sit, at the bottom and a gallery. But then had this particular stage, and all of his plays were written to fit within that stage. And so the Revelation's the same, and the whole Bible's the same. Everything takes place within the structure which is given to us in the tabernacle. And so once you understand that that's the stage that all of this occurs on, you get more of the jokes as well. So it's actually pretty cool. Yeah. So I think garden land world is the key, and today the garden is Christ in heaven, and there's the heavenly country. So the land part of history is now fulfilled and ascended. So we have, that's getting a bit complicated now, but anyway, instead of a bronze altar, that's now the incense altar, which is inside the house. And so there's no more bloodshed required, just the blood put on the horns of the incense altar as a memorial. So that's our communion, which remembers past bloodshed. And the world, the outer courts now is, the outer area, which is now being brought under the dominion of Christ. So he's already ruling it with a rod of iron. I mean, some of the things that have happened over the last couple of years in political history show that God has a sense of humor and he's going to turn the tables on people. Sure. Yeah, I think, is it Psalm 2 where it says he laughs at the nations? Maybe it's a different Psalm. Maybe it's Psalm 110. I can't remember. But anyway, I'm thinking God trolls the nations too,
Sure does. Sure does.
Yeah, but anyway, so garden land world, I think that's the key, that's what you get at the end of Revelation. It's like, okay, we've now finished Jesus' ministry in the garden, and the ministry of Jesus and the first fruit saints in the land as the first harvest. And then now this is going out into the world, and we can expect the same sorts of things to happen, kind of like growth rings in a tree. You know, it just keeps, the sound waves just keep going out as the word conquers the world, and we can see the same pattern of those four horsemen as they bring the message, divide the people, you know, the saints persevere, and then there's a judgment. So I think in our culture now, we've had the word of God for a long time. We're now seeing a real division in the culture with those who want to follow Christian principles at the very least and follow Christ at the best, and then those who are in total rebellion. And that's what we see in America now, where it's just being ripped in two, you know, like that's the sword of the Lord, you know, but we know from the biblical pattern what's going to happen here. I mean, it's to some degree, it's always different every time how it plays out, but you know, those who follow God will inherit history, and those who don't will be the ones on the wrong side of history. So, you know, yeah, that's how it goes. But also God's patient, you know, he's never going to do things. The sword comes when the time is up, when things when there's no other recourse, you know. It's, you know, God is justified because he's patient. He's warned, as with Israel's kings. He didn't do what he said. Same with Adam. He didn't do what he said. Adam didn't die straight away. God had a sacrificial substitute, and he goes, okay, you'll keep. With Cain should have died straight away. No, I'm going to put a mark on you because you're the God's anointed. No one else is going to wipe you out, because that's your fate rests with me. You're the firstborn. You're the firstborn king. If anyone's going to kill you, it's going to be me. You know. So Cain, his judgment is postponed. Israel's kings, once again, over a few hundred years, God postpones their judgment until finally the faithful have been removed, and then, you know, judgment falls. And in the first century, and that's one thing I love about the actual historical side, where you see God is so patient with Israel. You know, I think it's Peter who says we're not cut off like Sodom and Gomorrah. God is patient. And so the apostolic witness and Paul's ministry, you know, basically Israel just kept being threshed until all the chaff was gone. And then General Titus waited until Passover, so that all of the Jews from across the empire came to Jerusalem to celebrate. These would have been the Jews who rejected Paul's ministry. Think about it. They would have heard the gospel and they said no, and now they're all in one place. A bit like, was it Jehu who got all the priests of Baal in the building, you know? And yeah, it said, lock the doors. Lock the doors. And so they're all inside. And then judgment fell. So in one sense, it was only the bad guys that were actually destroyed in that sense. A lot of Christians were martyred, obviously, as witnesses. But, you know, when judgment fell, God had really just got the chaff all together and burnt it, gathered to the fire. So even in his judgment, God is so merciful and long-suffering. And we can apply that today. So if we get the interpretation right, we can apply it properly. I do have another article which is similar to the first chapter in Moses and the Revelation. And it's called Rescuing Revelation. And you can find that on the Theopolis Institute website, which is probably a little more, it's better explained, or it's a bit, you know, for beginners, I guess. But it's, so Rescuing Revelation. And that just takes you through the basic covenant structure and what the book is about. I do quote Joel McDermott as well from American Vision, because he wrote a book called Jesus versus Jerusalem, and just shows you how Jesus' ministry was a lawsuit. And so the parables need to be interpreted as a message, first interpreted as a message for the Jews of the day. And that's how we have to understand them. Then we can apply them correctly. So, Rescuing Revelation is a good place to start.
Amen. All right. Yeah, I appreciate that. There's a couple things maybe about the judgment, about the last days, that I imagine your studies will lead me to further study out. And I'm hoping that any full preterist that is listening, that they would begin to question, and say, what would be my response to that? As a brother in the faith, it's not about debating with you and having my full preterism be correct. It's, more so it's about just understanding how would I respond to that threefold structure. And, I believe that what you said is a good, credible response. And obviously I already understand, I already kind of know where I would go with my disagreement. But But again, I want to kind of study that out. And
I just want to mention too that having the threefold structure, I think is it 1 Corinthians 10 where Paul talks about Christ the first fruits, then those who how does he put it, at his coming anyway, those who receive at his coming. Yep. And then he says, and then comes the end. And we tend to put those, the second and third points together as though that's the second coming, and argue about whether that's AD 70 or the end of the world. But I would say that we have the same pattern there: garden, land, world. Christ the first fruits, then those are who are his at his coming, land. Then comes the end, world, when he gives up the kingdom to the Father, and death's destroyed, and all of those final things. So I think that if you get this pattern, that helps you to decide, well, both sides were kind of right here, and yet both sides were kind of wrong, because they're not working within this architecture. So we don't have to argue about whether it's AD 70 or the end of the world, because he's actually working through all three domains. So it's both. So
amen. I want to appreciate you saying that verse, because I have to admit you opened a can of worms for me with that one, because that's a verse that we bring up a lot at our church. I have a brother in the faith that always says that. He says, Christ, the first fruits, and then those that are his at his coming. He always creates that threefold structure. So I know
good to hear.
That's good. That's solid, because he's going to listen to this and he'll be encouraged. So that's awesome.
Well,
that's great. I appreciate that. Well, I'll tell you what, Mike, thank you for taking some time out of your evening to share with us your excitement, again, because I do appreciate your excitement in regards to biblical details. We definitely need more of that. And of course, your insights. Thank you for your books, your resources. And I'm hoping that we'll keep the communication open, and that, when I go through and maybe I find my full preterist apologetic to what you had said, maybe we can have further dialogue and continue what we did here.
I appreciate that. And I think, as I said before we started, if you've got people together who want to know what the Bible means and are willing to let the text speak, it's always good. It's a process. As James Jordan said, the church fathers were really, for all of their value, were really the church babies.
Amen.
Theology has progressed, and it's not a done deal yet. The Bible is like a territory to be taken dominion over. It's tricky for that purpose, because it gives us wisdom. And so just as Israel had to go and conquer the land, the Bible, in a sense, we get the basics, but understanding it is actually a work that makes us wise and makes us strong, and forces us to think. So we need to stand firmly on what we believe, but also to be open to the scriptures, and if someone sheds some further light on things. And I think that's why I write, is because I want to explain stuff that I got from James Jordan, and even sometimes move a little bit beyond that in application. Look, if I'm at home with anybody who loves the Bible, even a dispensationalist,
Amen.
I mean, yeah.
Amen.
Thanks for having me on. It's been good fun.
Hey, great. I'll keep in touch, and hopefully we'll continue to dialogue. God bless you, brother.
Yeah, you too. Good on you. Thanks, mate. Bye.
Go in peace. All right. Well, that was Mr. Mike Bull joining us on tonight's show. I do pray that you were edified and encouraged by that podcast. This is something new for me. This is something different. So, again, this was great. I do want to share with you, before I let you go and I send you off with our benediction, I just want to share two quotes from Mike Bull's book. He said, in talking about the Torah, he said, it is a frame of reference for every subsequent biblical text. We need to be going back to the law and to the prophets in gaining our understanding of biblical details. And then another one he had said, and you heard this a lot throughout today's show, was that if we start by looking at the shape of the entire pattern before we zoom in, we will not get lost in the details. Thank you, God, for just the blessings that we've had through Mike Bull's book, Lord. Thank you for those that may have tuned in this evening, Lord, and gleaned some insight, were edified by the things that were brought forth, Lord. And we just give you all the praise and glory. We thank you, Lord, for the knowledge of you. We thank you that you've given us the church, Lord, that you've created this institution, Lord, that will make known the manifold wisdom of God, that will be a receptacle of your truth. Continue to empower us, be with us, Lord, and we know you will. Allow us to be invigorated by that excitement of biblical things, Lord, that we would set our eyes on you, the author and finisher of our faith, that you may be further glorified. Thank you, Lord. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. If you don't mind, I'll just send you off with a benediction that I use in my common prayer, and I would like to bless you with it. May the peace of the Lord Christ go with you wherever he may send you. May he guide you through the wilderness, protect you through the storm. May he bring you home rejoicing at the wonders that he has shown you. May he bring you home rejoicing once again into our doors. Go in peace, saints. Thank you again for taking some time to tune in this evening.